Society Matters.
So after your time in the IDF, tell me about how you get from there to the Knesset, to working for Jonny Daniels. Go through that for me, how that happened.
So I finished the army. I was 21 years old. I met this girl. Like every 21-year-old, fell madly in love really quickly, got married very, very fast, too fast. And we had a beautiful daughter very, very quickly as well. And I was studying in Bar-Ilan University. I was in my first year. I was 22, married with a kid, studying full-time. And it turns out that kids are a little bit expensive.
There too, huh?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, well, I'm probably going to need to find a job as well.
Right.
So I start looking around and speaking to friends. Maybe someone knows something. And like, I wanted something interesting, right? I wasn't going to do anything boring. And I was kind of thinking about it. And a friend said to me, look, this lady who I know from London, who moved to Israel, she's involved politically. And there's this member of Knesset who's looking for a driver. I said, well, I know how to drive. So I applied for the job as a driver. And I got accepted as his driver. Turns out I wasn't necessarily the best driver. But within 6 months, I was his chief of staff.
Wow.
And kind of worked myself up from there. And that's really how it happened. It happens by by luck, I suppose. You know, people say there's luck, right? I mean, you make your own luck, right? If I wouldn't have gone out and asked, and I wouldn't have pushed, and I wouldn't have done this, I wouldn't have been willing to accept a job just as a driver, then I wouldn't have found my way to where I was.
Right. Fortune favors the prepared.
Absolutely.
And the persistent.
Correct. And so I just worked hard and quickly ended up leaving my studies because, you know, a chief of staff to a member of Knesset, you haven't got
full-time gig.
Oh, more than full-time, right? I mean, I was going to his house, which was north of Tel Aviv, where I was living, and then driving back south to Jerusalem every day, almost every single day. And days were 14, 15, 16-hour days. But I learned an unbelievable amount.
Yeah.
I learned a tremendous amount. Obviously not just about the inner works of politics, and which is in itself very interesting and important. Right. But also the mind of a politician's an interesting thing. They think different to us.
Yes.
And had a real opportunity to spend a lot of time with him. He at the time was the chair of a bunch of different committees, including the committee for like child's welfare, one of them as an example. And even there, like when Michal was born, my eldest, I was really frustrated that in the hospital, just as a simple example, in the hospital, my ex had a hard time initially breastfeeding. It was a normal thing.
Yeah.
And nurses come and help you teach how to do it, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
But the hospitals there, they were basically saying, just put them on child's formula. And this certain kind of formula. And I was like, what the hell's going on? They're giving like packages of formula with like free gifts and like a t-shirt for dad and a cap for mum. I'm like, this is weird. So when I got into the Knesset, we started to look into it.
Right.
And it turns out that those companies were sponsoring the maternity wards and the nurses who had an incentive to push this product. And we ended up passing a law that stopped that. And from there, I really understood the power also of politics. That in addition to just making a lot of noise and doing, you know, yelling.
Every now and again, something really good gets done.
And you can really make a difference. And like, even that, like, who knows as a result of that, how many more mothers will breastfeed, how much more healthy that is for children, how many people will be helped as a result of that in later life. There's so many, like that one thing, the ripple effects, just of that tiny little thing made me understand kind of the scale and the importance that one could do inside of politics.
And it got you addicted to it a little bit.
Very much. You know, the politics, as they say, it's like it's definitely a drug. You get that political bug inside of you and it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Even today, the amount of politicians that I'll speak to and call me on the phone, I'll call them, and all around the world. It's quite exciting. Last on Hanukkah, I ended up writing the Hanukkah speech for the president of the country of Georgia.
Wow.
Like, he had to give a speech on Hanukkah. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, I know him because he was an ambassador somewhere before we became friendly. He's like, sends me a message, dude, quick help. I'm like, what? He's like, the president needs a Hanukkah speech. I'm like, done.
Right.
I'm like, I don't know. I was sitting in my boxers at
home. A great speech for the
president of Georgia. Like,
president of
go
Georgia.
figure, right?
Right.
But this is kind of the fun of what you're able to do when you put yourself out there and meet people and talk to people.
And they believe you to be credible. They know your work and they believe in your skill set.
Right. Helps.
It helps.
It definitely helps.
So you developed that skill set. The position you were in, eventually he became the deputy defense minister. So talk to me a little bit about what that was like at that time and what you learned about. You came in and were someone who served in the IDF as a lone soldier, but now you're working on it from the other end of it. And so it's a very different perspective.
I mean, that whole time was fascinating. I mean, I can tell you that I think potentially the thing that gave me more of the skill set that I use today and was more opening was Danny also had the position as the head of World Likud. And as part of that position, he was responsible for a lot of different things abroad. And he, as a result of such, I traveled with him to a lot of different places. And one of the places that we traveled often was to the United States. And here in America was where I had the opportunity to really build an unbelievably interesting network, like truly fascinating. I mean, we're talking 13 years ago when then at that point I was doing stuff supporting the campaign of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And as an example, one of the things on the campaign, they turned around to me and I was getting American celebrities to do videos endorsing Netanyahu, like a fun thing. So right. I got the first person.
But powerful too.
Very powerful. I will say Israelis love that. It
Right.
looks good in Israel. People enjoy it. So the first person I got was Chuck Norris, just because it's super cool.
That's very cool.
Super cool. It was funny actually. We were going to film with Chuck, and then we got this very significant phone call that he'd had a shaving accident and cut a bit of his beard off and can't be on camera. So we had to do that just a voiceover or
Right.
whatever. And the second person was an American businessman that I'd created a relationship with, a guy called Donald Trump.
Ain't funny how the world comes around.
Boy, is it funny.
Yeah.
And, this was 14 years ago and maybe even more. And I'm sitting in his office and he's grilling me and asking me questions about Iran's nuclear capabilities.
Right.
But in-depth questions. He'd be like, explain to me the issue with intrafuges. Right? Which
Smart question.
Yeah, and surprisingly in-depth and interested and knowledgeable questions just for a businessman. And this was way back when there was the idea of being president was it was a joke.
Pipe dream.
It's like an actual pipe dream. I knew Sam Nunberg, the guy who was working with Roger Stone and who gave them the idea. I'd met them. I'd gone out for dinner with both of them around the time where he first floated the idea of running. And I'm like, at what point does he have to back out so it doesn't affect The Apprentice?
Right.
And they're probably, he'll say it for a little bit, then back off, and that will be that.
Right.
And the guy's just been elected for the second time as president of the United States, right? It's
a story
amazing.
You couldn't imagine.
Not in a million years, but it's incredible. Again, you put yourself out there, the people that you're exposed to, and then what that can lead down in later life, right? The same thing. When I was working in the Knesset, I was all foreign parliamentarians that were coming through, I built relationships with, which is what served me up until today. One guy who came often was the governor of Arkansas back then, a guy called Mike Huckabee, is now coming back to Israel as the ambassador.
The ambassador.
In fact, when I created my foundation, he had his show on Fox News, and he was the first person who said, come on my show on Fox, right? And which gave me the opportunity to really get where I am, massively. And so, it's all of these people along the way
that got that step.
But
one of the biggest things you did at the Knesset was you've got a huge percentage of the Knesset actually to go to Poland.
Yeah.
For the commemoration.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about that.
That was nuts. I mean, I was 26.
Yeah.
And I'd taken my first trip to Poland. I didn't want to go to the camps. I was always like, I don't want to give them my money. Like, it was that kind of mindset. And I'd grown up with Holocaust again, had a massive impact on my life. And I thought I'd seen and learned and read enough. And I took my first trip to Poland. And being there made me really understand how significantly important it is to visit the German Nazi death camps. It gets you in a different way. You have to see these places. You have to. And I was there, and I came back to Israel, and I was talking to friends who were journalists in Israel, and I said, look, like, so this is too important, too significant. So then I put together a little, like, delegation of a few members of Knesset,
Right.
and we went out to Poland, and we visited Auschwitz. And in Auschwitz, you see all the groups of students coming by, and there was a group of Israeli students who saw these members of Knesset. You know, they were excited, and with them was a survivor, and the survivor completely broke down. And he said, I never imagined that I'd one day be here with a member of Israel's parliament.
Right.
And that significance...
Because it's the full circle.
Full circle. That significance shook me, and I was like, okay, there's something about this. And with me were a few really good friends who were journalists and politicians now, as the mayor of Bat Yam and all these other significant people today. But they were just young guys like me at the time. And I said to them, we need to do something. I said, we need to have a session of the Knesset in Auschwitz. And they were like, good luck. Right. How'd you do that?
Right.
So I came back to Israel. I'm still thinking about it. And a friend of mine did a bit of work with Eddie Wiesel, of blessed memory.
Right.
And I said, could you get me in there? And he said, yeah, sure. So I went and sat with Eddie Wiesel for breakfast in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem.
Pretty beautiful spot to be sitting on.
It's the best spot there is.
Yeah.
And I said, look, you know, I'm a young guy, right? And I'd kind of like to be involved in this subject.
Right.
But who am I? Like, how dare I? Right? I've got no letters before or after my name. Right? I'm not a survivor. Right? Like, how dare I discuss the Holocaust or be involved in anything connected to this? And he said to me, Jonny, you've got this all wrong. He says, you have to. Right. He said, you know, you are my witness. He said, your generation have to stand up, and you're not.
Right.
Do it. So, you know, you can't get a bigger blessing than that.
Right.
So that gave me the first kind of kick and push. And then, still thinking about it, I went and my friend who was a journalist said, you need to meet with Noach Kliegel. Noach Kliegel was the oldest journalist in Israel. He was a survivor of Auschwitz. He boxed in Auschwitz. It's one of the ways he survived. And he was a brilliant journalist. In fact, he was so old school that he'd call in the articles, like the old days. And only he was allowed to do that.
Yeah.
So you had these other really high-level journalists, and if they picked up the phone by mistake, they were typing out Noach's article.
Right.
And I sat down with Noach, and I was like, I really think this is a good idea. And he said, this is a beautiful idea. And he took Israel's biggest newspaper, Yediot Ahronot, and the weekend edition, the weekend magazine had a huge picture of me on the front page with "He has a dream," and telling this idea of taking the Knesset to Auschwitz. And you know, there's sometimes things that you do when you're inexperienced that you'd never do in later life.
You don't know you're not supposed to be able to do it.
Correct. And you do things you probably wouldn't do. So the problem then was that there's never been in history a sovereign government who's held a session on the grounds of another sovereign government before. Right. Like, it's just not happened. So there's no way to know how to do it. The Poles also weren't overly keen, right? But they kind of have to invite the Knesset. The Knesset can't just tell the Poles that they're coming.
Right. They have to ask.
So, with time a little bit against us, I managed to maneuver and basically convince both sides that they'd sent letters, and the Poles I said, Israel, you guys, you've got to accept it. The letter's on the way, just accept it. Right. And by the time they'd accepted it, the Poles have been like, well, we can't not send it, because they've accepted. And so I didn't realize what mess I'd called until a few years later, when the guy who was responsible for Middle East in the Polish Foreign Affairs was like got in massive trouble because of me. And I found out later. But it happened. And for the first time in history, on January 27th, 2014, on the 69th liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the majority of the Knesset left Israel for one day. And we flew to Poland for the day. In fact, just now at the United Nations, a few days ago, Buzzy Herzog, the president of Israel, came up to me and says, I was just talking about that trip the other day. He came as the leader of opposition back
I'll
then.
never forget it, any of them.
Never. And walking into Auschwitz, walking into Birkenau, marching those streets, those awful, awful, awful places down those tracks, with the majority of Israel's parliament, with the Knesset guard standing with the Israeli flags. Wow.
Right.
Each member of Knesset had a Holocaust survivor with them. And the power and the little things throughout the day. We were standing outside, it was like minus 20 degrees Celsius. So what's that, like 0 Fahrenheit?
Right.
So awful, awful, awful. Colder than it's been here this winter.
Right.
And we were standing outside for the beginning of the ceremony. And there were two members of Knesset standing there. And one had said to the other, God, this is so cold, I don't know how anyone survived it. One of the survivors turned around to him and said, most of us didn't.
Right.
You know, and there was
Completely true.
So throughout the, like, each one of these people had an experience. Naftali Bennett was there as a minister of finance, I think, at the time. His first ever trip to Poland.
Right.
His first ever trip to Auschwitz. For most of these members of Knesset, this was the first time they'd ever been. And that pushed me, and my presumption was that I'd create this foundation from the depths. I like the name, right? It was significant, from the Book of Psalms, the deepest, darkest place, and from only from the deepest place you can come up. So the idea was to create this foundation, to do this event, and then I'll go back into politics and what I was doing, and you know, man plans and God laughs. And I ended up going from there into just a slew of other things within my foundation, which has kept me very, very busy until today.
But the unique part about it is, you know, for at least part of the time now, you live in Poland. You know, and I know, at least for my parents, who both were born and grew up in Poland, and that's where their Holocaust story began. They would never dream after the Shoah of living in Poland. But today is a very different situation, and some people feel very differently about it. So what was it about the Polish people, and then seeing our, you know, centuries of Jewish life in Poland, that attracted you not just for this one event, but to really put some roots there and get to know and find the righteous Poles, those that stood up, the upstanders of Poland?
You know, it started as doing work on ground and partnership with universities and looking for hidden heritage and history and dealing with things like tombstones that had been taken and misappropriated and Jewish cemeteries that were destroyed and mass graves. And the more and more and more and more time I'd spent there, the more there was this kind of unbelievable creation of a network of people who wanted to help. That was shocking to me, because I started, you know, the media were very interested in me as a 26-year-old guy. I was 27, actually, when the event happened. A 27-year-old guy who brought the Knesset to Auschwitz.
Right.
It was fascinating for the media.
Polish media.
Generally the media, but the Polish media especially.
Right.
You know, Poles have an incredible obsession with history, like probably more than anybody else. Like, you go to any gas station in Poland, there's 15 different magazines about the Second World War, right? Like, every Polish person knows it. Like, they lived that history. And so for them, it was very, very interesting. And, you know, I started to build this network of people who wanted to get up, wanted to support, wanted to do things. And it was eye-opening. And as much as people started coming to me with stuff, you know, they were, I think, a month before the opening of the Poland Museum, the Jewish Museum in Warsaw, and a Polish journalist reached out to me and said, my local park is built from Jewish tombstones. What are we talking about? Right. And I said, where? He says, in Warsaw. I said, you're kidding me. You know, it's a capital city, metropolitan city. Right. So we drive to Prague, the opposite side of the city, across the river, and we go to his local park and flip over the paving stones, and they're all Jewish tombstones. I said, what the hell's going on? So I go for a meeting with the mayor's office, and again, I've got a background in politics. I know how these things work. I go in there very nice and friendly, and the mayor's office, they said, oh, this is terrible. We've not heard about this. We're going to pass a budget, and we do a thing. Show us on a map where it is. And I'm like, okay. They knew
where it was.
So I said, you know what? And I played their game for like maybe 15 minutes. Then the Israeli came out, and a little bit of chutzpah. Right. And I said, you know what? I said, I've got an even better idea than showing you on the map. They said, oh, what's that? I said, well, in about a month, the museum's opening. And you've got all these journalists coming from all around the world. I said, how interesting would it be for them to see the juxtaposition of you building a beautiful new museum and at the same time having kids swing on swings above Jewish tombstones? Right. Could you imagine, Alan, that within 2 days they found the budget and started removing those stones? So, when things like that started happening and you could see an impact immediately that you were making and, doing things like when you come from a background in politics and media, you understand how to play with stuff, right? So some guy called us that in his allotment, right? In Poland, they have these allotments where they grow vegetables and stuff. In his allotment, he realized that the bench, it was this round bench made of stone, they'd moved it a bit and there was writing on it. They think it might be Jew writing. Right. I said, Jew writing, okay, send me a picture. So I had a look at Hebrew.
There you go.
Pre-war Poland, often a child who had passed away young, they'd make the matseva, the tombstone, in the shape of a tree trunk, as a life cut down young. Right. And so I get there and I'm looking at this thing and it's remarkably heavy. I'm going to rent a forklift truck or something. I can't lift this up. It's impossible. So I'm thinking about it. I'm like, I haven't my foundation's a small foundation. We raise money however we can. There's no budget for something like that. I've got to think outside the box. Now, growing up in London, one of the things my dad loves watching were those Eastern European strongmen competitions. They lift cars on their heads and stuff. I love that stuff. So, and the Poles are always pretty good at that. So we reached out to Poland's strongest man, who came with a couple of his buddies. Right. These gibongous, scary looking fellas.
Good at lifting up tree trunks.
They're lifting up tombstones. And when we brought it back to the Jewish cemetery, there was a group there from Israel at the time visiting, and have the guards outside front. Right. We got out the car and walked towards it. The guards really should have asked what was going on. They took a look at the three of us.
Said, we're not asking.
The guy literally just moved aside. I was like, do whatever you want. I don't get paid enough for this. Right. And then we brought the tombstones back. Again, massive media story. And then that pushes out into more and more stories and information and heritage and history that was just waiting to be discovered. And Poland is, it's Central Eastern Europe. Yep. And from there, everything else is in front of you. We're just a drive from Belarus, from Lithuania, from just up to Latvia. And then we started doing all the work all the way down to Albania, right, where there was an incredible history during the Holocaust. Yeah. And so that really ended up being a significant hub.
Now, at one point, someone brought to you a pretty incredible find, a Jewish artifact, as they put it. A farmer found it. Can you tell me briefly a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we had students who were volunteering with us from the University of Warsaw, and we'd sent them to different geographical locations, and we'd sent them to places where there were heavy pre-war Jewish populations, but everybody was wiped out. The kind of places where everyone was sent to Treblinka, which was, no one survived. Right. So the students were going from town to town and speaking to locals, looking to uncover heritage and history. We'd found mass graves in people's gardens and, awful things. And the students ended up in the home of a Polish shepherd, a very simple man. And long story short, this shepherd had saved, as the final wish for his neighbor, a Torah that was entrusted to the shepherd's father during the Holocaust. The rabbi who'd asked his neighbor to save it had said, look, please just look after this until I come back, or another Jew will come and know what to do. And the rabbi never came back.
And we know why he never came back.
So for 75 years, this Torah was lying under this rabbi's sofa. Unfortunately, the family had fallen on hard times, not out of malice, but they'd used over half of this Torah. He used
Because
the
it's made of
parchment,
parchment.
so they
Leather.
used it, and this find ended up taking me on an incredible journey, and a journey that I'm really very, very proud of.
Today you go around all over the world and you take the hand of people some as old as 100 and more, and you guide their hand as you repair every letter of the Torah, letter by letter, to rewrite it and make it a kosher Torah once more.
And 100%, I don't think there's anything more beautiful than that.
And for survivors, it makes their world.
Yep.
Yeah, that's work that no one can ever thank you enough for. I'll tell you that as a child of survivors, for sure.
Thank you.